This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Here's your host, Brandon Contes.
Alrighty, welcome to episode 110 of the Awful Announcing Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Contes, and this week we were joined by ESPN college football writer Bill Connelly. Bill is also the author of 3 books throughout his career, the latest being Forward Progress, the definitive guide to the future of college football, which will be released September 2nd. It was a great conversation with Bill to help kick off the college football season. We talked about the health and the future of the sport. We discussed some of the more recent drastic changes to college football, like NIL and realignment, and the importance of avoiding the fall from grace that NASCAR experienced in the late 2000s. We discussed whether college football needs a commissioner and whether college football needs the NCAA. We also talked about the use of analytics in college football before finishing up with some season headlines on Bill Belichick, Arch Manning, and others. As always, make sure you rate and subscribe to this podcast. Make sure you also subscribe to Awful Announcing's YouTube page and enjoy this week's episode of the Awful Announcing Podcast with guest Bill Connelly. All right, he once officially nominated himself for the unofficial position of college football commissioner. He writes about college football and soccer for ESPN. He also wrote 3 books, including his latest titled Forward Progress, the Definitive Guide to the Future of College Football, which will be released September 2nd. He is Bill Connelly. Bill, thanks so much for joining us on the Awful Announcing Podcast today. You've written 3 books about college football, all very different. Did you have more fun writing one than the others?
Well, the newest one was definitely the biggest challenge. One was, the first one, Study Hall, was kind of a, analytics, but it was in 2013 when analytics weren't really a thing. It was about like maybe where things could go in the future. The second book, 50 Best, was basically a history book. And then this one is a future book. It was a tricky. I'd say it's the most rewarding for sure, but it took a little while to get things where I wanted them to be. And, being that the sport never stops, it's already outdated in a couple places, but I won't tell you where.
What was the inspiration behind writing the book?
I mean, honestly, it was just as much as anything because I wanted to figure out what I thought about all the different kind of, different types of change that were hitting college football at the same time. Obviously we're in a weird place where after 60 years of yelling about paying players and yelling about, having a playoff or a big playoff and all these different things and conference realignment, all these different avenues, suddenly we just got these massive, massive lurches. And, I like having a vision of where I think things should go, but I was suddenly kind of struggling to just kind of isolate my thoughts in certain ways. So this ended up being kind of a half history book, half manifesto of sorts, where we talk about realignment, we talk about arguing about a playoff and television and paying players and all the different things. And then, try to spin things forward a little bit as to where things are probably going and where they should go. When did you start writing it? December 23 is when I started piecing together the intro chapter. And then, through the rest of that off season, tried to, get things laid out as appropriately as possible. And then had to hand in half the book, a manuscript in November, and then the other half in January. So it was a lot.
It is interesting because like most fans, not just college football fans, but fans in all sports, a lot of them, they like to look back more than look forward. Like for many fans, the past was better than the present, and the present is already ruining the future. So in your opinion, how healthy is college football today?
Well, and that's something I mentioned in one of the chapters is, any change we don't like, we assume is killing college football. And And it doesn't. You can't really find any measures right now that suggest college football is anything other than extremely healthy. Not that we have good measures for that, but TV ratings are good. Attendance levels are good. Like it certainly seems like the arrows are pointed in the right direction in that regard. So it becomes more of a thing where you're searching for warning signs more than here's why college football is terrible and has fallen apart and is dead or whatever. So there is a chapter basically called How Sports Fall from Grace, looking at, NASCAR and kind of college baseball, kind of baseball or college basketball and baseball, about how, just things were here, and then before anybody realized they could do anything about it, things were down at a lower level, and just trying to piece together, what we should be watching for, because nobody wants to actually kill college football, and it doesn't appear to have happened just yet.
Yeah, I thought that the chapter on how sports fall from grace was interesting, especially that comparison to NASCAR. How conscious is college football of what happened to NASCAR?
I mean, I know there's overlap. ESPN's Ryan McGee has told whoever he could think of about in college football about NASCAR through the years, and the warning signs, and how it's great to hunt for casual fans. That's kind of where the big money is, but you can't alienate your hardcores in the process, because if some kind of external crisis hits, like NASCAR and the 2008 financial crisis, and the fact that, people weren't writing $30 million sponsorship checks anymore, suddenly they realized, a lot of that was falling apart, and they needed the hardcores to lean on. And those hardcores had kind of gone elsewhere to a certain degree. They'd been alienated by, moving races and this and that. So yeah, I mean, I would assume that some people have heard those lessons, but one of the major issues for college sports right now is the people who have the most influence are of extreme self-interest. Like Greg Sankey has to act on behalf of the SEC presidents, or he'll lose his job to somebody who will. And he's kind of the most powerful person in the sport, because there's nobody above him to tell him you can't do that. So when you're acting on your own behalf and acting just in kind of self-interest, as those jobs are defined, nobody's acting on the part of college football. And it's just something you really have to be conscious of.
Yeah, turns out you could have also used Cracker Barrel as an example of alienating fans and falling from grace.
It's apparently not hard to do.
Yeah, and no idea that people felt so strongly about that, like dark gray colored lattice inside the Cracker Barrel restaurants. I know a lot points to the financial crisis in 2008 as part of why NASCAR's popularity started to decline, but it was also, and you mentioned, an aging fan base and retiring drivers.
Yeah.
College football doesn't have to really worry about that, because the most popular schools and teams aren't retiring. Like, no matter what changes do or don't happen to the sport, Alabama, Ohio State, Notre Dame, like the most popular schools and teams are still going to be there to hopefully lure big fan bases. Is that a sort of lifesaver for college football?
Yeah, it certainly doesn't hurt. I do think there's kind of this vision. I was working from this vision of, what is the healthiest possible version of the sport? It's where, the teams are playing, the opponent's fans want them to play, and the athletes are well taken care of, and everybody understands the stakes. Everybody has a role to play in the process, and if you field a really good team, you're rewarded for doing so, and all these things that are kind of broad. Like, obviously, we're not going to move Tennessee to another city. We're not going to do any sort of big things like that. But if you have a situation where the fans can't relate to the team anymore, they don't even know the players on the team because the roster just flipped entirely, and you're not all that great, and you're not playing your big rival like you used to. There are plenty of opportunities for fans to disengage in certain ways that you just kind of, again, like right now, it seems like we've skated through a lot of change. All right. But in terms of warning signs, that feels like a pretty big one.
Yeah. In your what not to do list for college football, which is the most important thing college football should do to avoid becoming a story like NASCAR?
Well, I do think the most important one was one of the ones towards the end of that list where you don't have the control over everything that you think you do. Whether it's NASCAR and the financial crisis, whether it's college basketball being in a really good place for the most part in the 90s, and then every single realignment move that happens in the decades that follows hurts college basketball in a way. You aren't ever in control, in the amount of control that you want to be. And so you should probably not act like you're always going to be in control and know where things are going, and the arrow's only going to go up and all that. Like, that's just having that little in the back of your head, being able to remind yourself of that, and remember that maybe we can't just, short term isn't all that matters right here. I think that helps a lot, and it certainly doesn't feel like college football always pulls that off.
There are a lot of college football and college basketball fans who like to treat the NIL as if it's killing college sports. From your perspective, how has NIL been for college football?
I mean, first of all, when you watch a college football game on Saturday, it still looks like college football. That was number one. Is athletes aren't walking off the field in protest. I'm not paid enough to get hit like that. There's nothing changing in that regard. Obviously, we had the Matthew Sluka case last year, which was pretty interesting. And certainly there have been bridges to cross like that, like Nico Iamaleava this past spring. But when you're watching college football on Saturday, still looks the same. It's still, the offenses haven't changed much, nothing like that. So I think, that is certainly a good place overall, just on a very broad level. But no, I mean, the way rosters are managed behind the scenes has completely changed. It certainly affected coaches' quality of life to a certain degree. And I am kind of curious. I think the biggest warning sign, because this does come back to fans a lot, the fans have to show up or else nothing matters. From a fan perspective, like I said, like if your team's doing well and you don't really recognize the players, but they're kicking butt for your team, you probably don't care all that much. The wins are going to take care of everything else. But it's all about that opportunity to disengage. And if you really can't keep up with who's on your team, you don't know the half the starters when the season starts. And then also, like I said, you're not playing the teams you want to play. Like at some point, especially as prices go up, at some point you're like, I don't think I'm going to buy season tickets next year. Maybe I'll just buy this one. I'll go to one game or something like that. And any sort of scaling back should be a red flag for the sport as a whole, you would think.
What has changed the landscape of the sport more, NIL or realignment?
I would say realignment and the portal specifically. NIL is certainly a big part of it, because if you're not getting the money you want, then you'll want to look elsewhere. But I do think the transfer portal, the way that all this, the freedom that athletes should have had for 70 years suddenly came all at once with minimal regulation. That was certainly a really, really big thing. But you think about it in terms of just overall ripples, it's hard to beat realignment just in terms of, the money involved with the top conferences, the fact that we've officially broken geography for most of the top level of the sport, and the fact that, whatever you want to say, Stanford and USC aren't playing, but USC and Rutgers are. Just a lot of that stuff has really, really, really altered just a given Saturday and who's showing up at your stadium. And that's pretty big. It's hard to beat that one, I think.
Yeah. You have a chapter talking about the impact of TV on college football. Does ESPN and Fox deserve any blame for realignment?
Well, I think, who was it? It was Ryan Nanny and Stephen Godfrey on there who killed college football thing last year, talking about, they had a really good, it was like the old, the scorpion parable of like, the scorpion acted like a scorpion. How can you blame me for acting like a scorpion? That's certainly kind of how I've seen a lot of the TV stuff playing out here, is that, TV has absolutely had an interest. Like I said, in the television chapter, if there was an imaginary board of directors for college football, like, the networks have places at that table because they have a pretty big interest in how things play out. But, the fact that, for me, the number one thing circles back around, and it's TV's acting like TV, but the fact that nobody's in charge to say, no, you can't do that, ends up being the biggest thing, because TV offers money and conferences take it, and nobody's there to regulate that. So that's been a big thing. I've always tried to, even before I worked for ESPN, I've had the same line about how, like, the more football I watch, the more I like college football. And the fact that I can watch any game from FBS down to NAIA is pretty amazing. So television has had an amazing role just on my ability to like football, but the money side has obviously impacted decision-making, and there's been no regulation at all for that.
Has ESPN's relationship with the SEC affected your job at all? Like, do you feel ESPN does a good job of covering the SEC like a neutral party?
Yeah, nobody tells us what to write. Like that's never been an issue. Obviously, it affects my social media interactions quite a bit. And I did have to point out, I couldn't help but point out that, the old story about Charles Woodson winning the Heisman and SEC fans being mad at ESPN because it's a Big Ten network. Like it's come full circle, obviously. But yeah, nobody's telling us what to write or what opinions to have.
Is streaming a potential detriment to college football? Like we'll go back to the NASCAR comparison, where the older fan in rural America doesn't want to watch a race on Prime. How important is it for college football to keep the biggest games on network TV?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly. So I don't know for sure that it's a problem, but it's a little bit of it's a little scary just because one of the warning signs in that how far sports fall from grace chapter was you keep your competition where people can see it.
Yeah,
and that's obviously the number of subscriptions if you want to watch every game, like I just said. Even if you just you're an Ohio State fan wanting to watch every game, now you got to sign up for Peacock as well. You have all these different options as to cable or the standalone sports streaming apps and all these things. You just have more decisions to make and more different places to send your money, and that is certainly something to keep in mind. Like, we'll see if it's a problem, but it's certainly something that I think boxing struggled with in the past and other sports. Like, it's a concern, at least, even if it's not a problem.
What is the most common complaint about college football that you hear from fans?
I do think, the NIL is easy to complain about. That's probably still the most high volume. But I don't know. Actually, I mean, now that I say that, I do think some of the bitterness recently from conference realignment and some of the really big moves that happened over these past few years, there are some pretty big fault lines there. So I have a good friend who's a Big Ten fan, a fan of a Big Ten school, and he's kind of disengaged over the last couple of years because his team wasn't very good and he didn't know any of the players. But you do think like we have completely cut off fan bases like Oregon State and Washington State as well, and that's probably an even bigger deal.
I mentioned it at the top, but in 2017, you decided to run for the position of college football commissioner. Of course, that there is no position of college football commissioner, nor is there an election for that non-existent position. But how successful was that campaign for your career? Like, how much attention did that get?
I don't know about, if it increased attention, but people who already followed me liked it. I know that.
Yeah.
It's, for the things that I was known for at SB Nation, it was either that getting brought up or my SP Plus rankings, obviously.
Yeah.
Or the headline we had on a Kansas football preview one year where Kansas isn't going to be very good, but at least they'll get fresh air and exercise. Those are the things that people are most likely to bring up. We had a really cheesy photo shoot for that commissioner campaign. And it still shows up. Like, if somebody just Googles my name for a picture for like a radio hit or something, it's probably going to be like me looking up at the sky with a football in my arm. And I didn't really quite think that one through or think it forward on that one, but it served its purpose.
It's cool that we can kind of look back and see what you said needed to happen in college football 8 years ago. And you did hit on a lot of your list in the last decade or so. What changed to college football were you most surprised that it actually did come to fruition?
Number one thing on that list was addressing amateurism rules. That one, I don't know if that was a surprise necessarily. It was certainly jarring when it actually happened. It was pretty clear it was going to happen. It should have been, the NCAA settled on an NIL case even before O'Bannon long ago. And from that point forward, it was clear what was eventually going to happen. But the way things played out, the fact that we're actually paying players now for performance, no matter what, or for recruitment, no matter what the rules actually say, that is a really, really big thing. And I do think, looking back at stuff we were talking about, that commissioner thing was in 2017. Obviously, the entire 2010s, we're talking and writing about that. To see the way things played out once we actually got NIL and had it be legalized, the fact that NCAA just continued to fight it and never set any sort of regulations like they could have in 2013 or something. Collectives were never a thing. That was never a thing that was ever discussed in any way, shape, or form. And then that became the biggest piece of NIL. We weren't talking about that. We were talking about signing autographs at the mall and stuff.
Yeah.
And so that was certainly the way things actually played out when they could play out was certainly a surprise, I think.
What is the most important thing that college football needs to fix now, looking at the next 8 years?
Share money. Like, that's, so much of, I think what concerns me the most is the way that money is being distributed to fewer and fewer schools. Like, I wrote a piece last year about with basically like the stroke of a proverbial pen, we added 7 games to the college football schedule with the expansion of the playoff, and it immediately basically created like $700 million extra dollars in revenue per year for college football as a whole. And the Big Ten and SEC basically said, we'll take that. Never mind that, we're paying players now and we can make sure that that's as healthy a process as possible. No, just 2 conferences vacuumed up most of that excess. And, Memphis went from getting whatever it was, 1.7 million a year from the playoff to 1.8. But then, now Mississippi State gets 20 million a year no matter what. And that's just, the more the money gets pooled at a smaller number of schools, that has a very, very obvious effect, whether we're talking about college football or basically any other walk of life, really. And it concerns me a lot. If we're just siphoning off the number of schools that can actually compete at any level, really, in FBS, that's fewer fans that have a reason to engage in the first place. And that seems like a bad thing to me.
Why did you choose the 2006 Rose Bowl to go back and watch that for the start of the book?
Well, number one, I realized when I started piecing it together that if I was writing this, it was probably going to come out in 2025, which would be the 20th anniversary of the 05 season. So that alone made it a pretty nice hook. But then when I actually went back and watched it and took my notes and everything else, I realized that it was even better than I thought, because it really was kind of a bridge between a previous era where you've got fullbacks in the game and Keith Jackson's on the call. And, it was the Big 12 champion Texas versus the Pac-10 champion USC, all these things that had changed since then. It felt like the end of that era and the beginning of a new one where you had, superhuman guys like Vince Young and Reggie Bush. And you saw the kind of the initial inklings of like zone read and a lot of the stuff that would come in the years that followed. And it was just this huge game in HD that, it really felt like it was the beginning of this era too. So being able to go back and watch that game and kind of document everything that's changed, it just felt like a really nice narrative device, and it worked out a little even better than I thought, I think.
Is there a more recent game that, you go 15, 20 years from now that we'll look back and say, hey, that game had a similarly big impact on the sport?
I don't know. Probably not. I mean, there have certainly been amazing games. The 17 playoff where you had Alabama or Georgia, Oklahoma, and then Alabama, Georgia. The amazing Georgia, Oklahoma game, and then the Tua 2nd and 26. Like that was fantastic for the sport, just in terms of that was the one time we kind of got good semis and finals. And it was a really nice 1-2 punch, but it was still kind of early in the lifespan of the playoff. It still wasn't even really a playoff. It was one extra game at the end of the year. So I don't know, like this first year of the 12-team playoff had a chance to be pretty momentous. And I think it was just from the home fields in the first round and everything that played out, but there wasn't one specific game I think that will carry forward. Maybe if Penn State wins, or if Penn State or Notre Dame wins this year, maybe that semifinal from last year will become something. But that was the 05 Texas USC. That was kind of one of a kind, I think.
Does college football need the NCAA?
Well, I've never really worried about that all that often. Like, obviously there are potentially huge changes coming, but in my mind, I always remember that the NCAA is the schools. So if they create a new organization, it's still going to be made up of schools that are calling the shots with, a commissioner or some sort of figurehead up top to take all the arrows. But like, to me, the school presidents are still kind of one of the bigger issues in this sport. And that'll be the same whether we have a new organization to get mad at instead of the NCAA or not.
Would college football be better off with a commissioner?
I still I tried to acknowledge in the piece, like, commissioner doesn't solve a ton of problems. We have plenty of sports with bad commissioners. And, whether we're talking about Major League Baseball or FIFA or whatever, having a figurehead doesn't mean you're going to be like super well run and not corrupted or anything like that. But it still feels like not having one is worse, because we still have a ruler of the sport, and it just happens to be 2 conference commissioners with their own list of self-interests. And if we're going to have that anyway, we might as well have somebody on top of them that can maybe say no every now and then.
Does it almost feel like it would be an impossible job, though? Just like having one voice attempting to lead the Big Ten and the SEC, and just like, obviously there's so many more teams that and schools that they would have to be focused on, as opposed to like the NBA, NFL, MLB, where it's between 30, 32 teams.
Yeah. I mean, I think like, yeah, obviously we can. I know I'm not the only one who said, like, I should be in charge. I should make all the decisions. And I'm, in my head, I would be, a perfectly non-corrupt leader in every way. I wouldn't care what people think. And that's not usually how it ends up being when you're in these positions. But no, I do think like the simple act of, even, people will inevitably bring up, say, Greg Sankey. He should just be and even in that role, when he's not answering specifically to SEC presidents, he could at least make a few different decisions along the way. That feels like the bare minimum of what we could do to stop the kind of the hoarding of resources with a smaller number of schools. So yeah, I'm not going to pretend like it would make things 100% better, but it would probably make it 1% at least.
If everything was uniform and regulated fairly and all conferences were working in cohesion under one voice, one commissioner, would it take away from what college football is at all? Like, does college football kind of embrace the debate and chaos that stems from the current setup?
Oh, it's still going to be messy and chaotic. That's just the way it's going to go when when you have 18 to 22-year-old males trying to corral a pointy ball. Like, that's always going to be part of the equation, and I don't want to take that part away.
Yeah.
But I do. Like, it is one of those things where any characteristic that you've had for a long time, like being rulable, so to speak, like college football has been, we act sometimes like that's part of the DNA. Therefore, why would you want to change it? I think we could change certain parts of that DNA and not really run into any issues. I do think, like, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube here. We can't really, that would have a chance to rule the sport is going to turn around and say, okay, now A&M and Missouri back to the the Big Eight in the Southwest Conference. We're not going to recreate, 1984 or anything, but just being able to, create a revenue sharing program or salary minimums or any sort of thing that could actually kind of benefit the sport as a whole would be a lovely step, I think.
Is parity something that college football strives for?
I mean, it never has, obviously. And when you've got the investment, when you have Ohio State alums investing what they invest, and Texas versus, Ohio and Texas San Antonio and whatever, like, you're never going to have parity. And nobody who I think talks about competitive balance or sharing money or whatever is saying, like, we should enter a year where Central Michigan and Michigan have an equal shot at the national title. Nobody's saying that. But again, for me, it's just about making sure that the richest schools don't distance themselves so much that the next Boise State can only, can't even play for a national title because they're not part of that division. Making sure that if we have a situation like 2007 again, where we had a whole bunch of teams that were suddenly involved in the national title race, making sure those blip years can still happen because the schools with the most resources don't have so many more resources that they can never fall. And that, really, we're never going to have balance in any major way, but it feels like that should at least be attainable. And we're starting to drift toward an era where I'm not sure that's the case.
I know you've written a lot about the idea of relegation in college football. Is there any chance that we could see that happen?
We did. I mean, in the short term, probably not. But we did the thing the Mountain West considered a couple of years ago after the Pac-12 fell apart and they were trying to figure out, the best possible approach moving forward. I think, it was an associate AD at Boise State put together a presentation of we should expand to 24 teams with 3 tiers of 8 and, relegation in between the levels and everything. Like, it got to that level. It got to where a real conference was actually discussing things to that degree. Obviously, they chickened out and they did the most college sports thing imaginable and basically said, well, let's just create 2 Mountain Wests that'll compete with each other instead. And I hate that. But it was discussed. And one of the lessons that I tried to take away from the writing of the book is we don't necessarily, the vision of the future that we have is never completely accurate. So it doesn't feel like it could ever happen, but I think it starts that way. It starts with a conference. Like, how many problems would be solved by the ACC to split it into 2 tiers and relegating an 8-team conference and a 9-team conference, and kind of going about their business in that way with promotion and relegation each year. Like that would solve some issues. And I do think maybe we get to that stage, but a lot of people are going to chicken out before somebody actually pulls the trigger on it.
Yeah. As somebody who has no rooting interest in college football, like I could see myself being more interested in watching a game that like with a slot in the SEC on the line, like as unrealistic as it is, I just like late in the season slot in the SEC on the line.
Yeah,
watching that game versus a more traditional bowl game. How important are bowl games right now?
Well, I think we definitely have to accept that they don't mean what they used to.
Yeah.
But it's still a reward for a decent to good season, and people still watch them. So really, in my head, it has almost gone back to what the original intention of bowls were, which really was to just, hey, you had a great year, enjoy this trip to Miami. It was an exhibition, didn't even count towards the national title race until the 60s. So, they list your national champion on December 3rd, and then a month later they'd play in a little celebration game. So it's kind of that again. Obviously, it's only going to play so much of a role in the national title race. And if we get our way and we get quarterfinal home games, that'll play even less of a role. And that's fine, really. Like, this spring, I wrote a piece about what things could look like moving forward. And if we just had, quarterfinal home games, took those 4 games that get left out and pit pair off number 17 through 24, you'd have had an Illinois Missouri Rose Bowl last year, which does not garner national title hype, but those fan bases would have loved it. They would have shown up, they would have sold out, and it would have gotten good ratings because it'll always get good ratings. So it can still mean a lot. It can still have its role to play, but basically bowls went from a thing that kind of helped to prop up and promote college football at the end of the season when, teams could only be on television once or twice a year. And therefore it was like your only chance to see the stars of the year or the Heisman winner or whatever. It played a great role then. And then they clung to that relevance for so long that it held the sport back for decades, really. And it is what it is. I think they still have a role to play.
How did college football react to Donald Trump saving college sports executive order? Like, is that something that they take seriously? Do they like that the president of the United States kind of weighs in on that topic?
I didn't really get any reaction whatsoever because a lot of it was stuff that's already coming through legislation or whatever. I think people are just kind of waiting till we know where things are going to end up eventually if the government steps in one way or another. It's just, when do we have to actually do this? When do we have to actually act? I don't think it's changed the timelines in that regard. Maybe it changes the timelines of the legislation that eventually comes that really does kind of force the issue. But no, it seemed to, this is college football and the news cycles are real fast. So within a couple of days, I don't think anybody was really thinking about it anymore.
Are there college football coaches who like pay for play, and or do they all just view it as a headache?
I think it's a bigger headache now than it would be in a more organized system in the future. And I think no matter what coaches say, there's always been pay for play in college sports, obviously. So I think in a lot of cases, a lot of coaches are basically rooting for it because at least you kind of get it out in the open and you can create rules. We're in kind of this middle ground right now where there's no collective bargaining agreement. We know we're eventually going to get to something resembling that in the future, but you can't really figure out how the map's going to take you from point A to point B yet. So yeah, the rules are getting kind of made up on the fly and coaches are getting exhausted and that just, it's just a middle ground. We're going to get to that point eventually. And I think it can only help coaches in that regard. I think a lot of the staunch traditionalists are well gone and the sport has been drifting this way for a while.
So what is the ideal setup for coaches? Cause if pay for play is a good thing and NIL is a good thing in terms of recruiting talent and things like that. but it is obviously this additional responsibility and task for them. What is the balance and the ideal setup for coaches?
Well, I think just for coaches specifically, there's a reason why every time, after the football coaches convention in January, or anytime coaches have any say whatsoever, they talk about having one transfer window. I don't know if that's possible with an academic year. We're going to find out, but there's a reason why. And it's because you have to sign your freshman in December and then get through that transfer window period and lock your roster down. And then in the spring, you got to do it all over again because the player who asked for more money or demanded more money to not jump into the portal in January is doing it again in April because there's another window and he can do it all over again. And it's just hard to, all these coaches are hiring general managers or, basically guys to do cap math and whatnot, but you can't ever plan right now in this sport. And because the windows are what they are, and there's always your roster management process has to start at like 3 different times in a given year. So from that perspective, anything that helps with that is key. And I still don't know what's possible in that regard because of the academic year. Do you really want guys not being able to transfer until spring when they basically checked out for the last 4 months because they knew they were going to? Like, I don't know if that's better either, but there's a reason why coaches want that for sure.
When did you take an interest in advanced stats?
Well, I was pretty good at math. That was a big part of it. And even though I stopped liking baseball because I'm a Pirates fan, I still like baseball stats. For a long time, I would kind of just keep up with things that just made sense, obviously, because baseball, there's a reason why baseball caught on. They make the most sense really with analytics. And so when I started a Missouri blog in early 2007, just as the offseason was really about to hit, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write about that summer and to fill the content void. And I thought, well, okay, let me Google college football analytics, see what exists there, see what we can play with. And nothing really came back at that point. It was a pretty empty space. So, Brian Fremeau had just started writing to Football Outsiders. So I contacted Aaron at Football Outsiders too, started just fiddling, entering play-by-play into spreadsheets. And, I stole the Football Outsiders success rate measure, kind of tweaked it for, I thought was better parameters for college, created my own little points model for explosiveness, and just kind of went to town from there and started writing for Outsiders in 2008 and then full time with SB Nation and Football Study Hall and all that in 2011. So yeah, it started with a void. And then, when I realized nobody was really in the space, I started trying to, occupy as much of that space as possible.
Were college coaches and programs using analytics and advanced stats before fans realized they were? Like in baseball, sabermetrics were, right. It was a thing before Moneyball was made into a movie. I don't know if fans were always aware of it. I don't even know if the writers were always aware of it, because for so long you still needed to get close to 20 wins as a pitcher to win the Cy Young, even though it was largely a meaningless stat. So were college teams paying attention to this before, long before fans even realized?
Well, there were some younger coaches who definitely, either reached out or, just guys I would interact with. So I know they were out there. As far as the guys leading the programs in, say, 2011, there probably weren't many of them. Well, what's funny, though, with football is nobody seeks better information regarding, opponent tendencies than college football coaches, or football coaches in general, I should say. They kind of have this natural analytical bent when it comes to seeking that stuff out. And even if they say they don't use analytics, they're probably using yards per play to look at certain information. So they've always had that in them. And I think just over the last 10 or 15 years, maybe they've gotten a little better at the stats they use. Like they just use better stats as opposed to more. And I think that's had at least a little bit of an impact. Obviously the fourth down stuff was kind of the most public breakthrough, you could say. And I kind of half joked on Blue Sky the other day during the Kansas State-Iowa State game. We had Kansas State going up for it on 4th and 1 in their territory in the fourth quarter. And then you had Iowa State deciding to not kick a field goal up 3 and try to ice the game with an actual fourth down attempt like that. That was kind of crossing the Rubicon there. I'm curious. We've gone a long way in a short amount of time with fourth downs and just the things that are acceptable. And I'm curious if that continues. I think it will.
Does the nature of football make it harder to use analytics? Like just the way the ball bounces is obviously so much harder to predict than other sports.
Yeah, I mean, I think during the week, the way you scout opponents or self-scout, just being able to, like I said, you might use yards per play, but if you're looking at formations and different alignments, then instead of using the average 4.8 yards per play out of this, being able to isolate things into efficiency like success rate, like what I've done, talked to plenty of coaches about that. Just little things like that, I think, make a humongous difference during the week. But in game, yeah, I mean, other than having the book for telling you when to go for it on fourth downs, like there are only so many cases you can use on a given Saturday. A lot of that's if change comes, it's gonna be Sunday through Friday.
Yeah. What about college football fans? Do they embrace the analytics and those are they receptive to advanced stats? Do they embrace those metrics or still kind of roll their eyes at them?
Well, I mean, I certainly still, each time I put out new SP Plus rankings, somebody's seeing it for the first time and reacting in a certain way if their team's 20 spots lower than they think. So we're still getting there, but I do think, it just has kind of infiltrated the sports world a lot more at this point in every sport. And so even whether you accept it or not, you're just kind of, I think a lot of people are just more used to it at this point. And the way it's kind of, it has certainly affected the discourse, even if it's just talking about fourth downs and whatnot. I think even in football it has.
We'll just talk about a couple of headlines before we finish up. Were you confident that Bill Belichick was going to make it to the season after he signed with UNC back in January?
I understand like the way that the headlines were going. I understand why people wanted to talk more about that, but he's in this to coach football first. I was surprised he didn't just go to D3, go back to his old conference of his alma mater and find some school there and just kind of hole up and coach ball for 10 years. This was this wasn't quite the move I expected, but this is the good part for him. So I never expected him to bail before he got to actually coach ball again.
How do you think he's going to do running a college program?
I mean, this roster, everything about his roster this year screams 6-6. So that's where the bar is. We'll see, all sorts of former NFL assistants and GMs and whatnot floating around. We'll see exactly how they can go. But if he's the teacher we've all heard about through the years and just likes, watching a kicker and trying to help a kicker get better or whatever. Like there is certainly a developmental angle here where maybe he can coax more out of that squad, but 6-6 just sounds right for this team, I think.
Do you think Nick Saban stays retired or do you think he eventually makes his way back to coaching?
Everything he said right after he retired, just about it not being the same sport and not wanting to deal with, players demanding more money and all those things. And you combine that with the fact that he seemed surprised by how much he enjoyed himself doing game day and all that stuff on that side. It would shock me because he is, I don't remember how old, but in his 70s.
Yeah.
And I think he already kind of passed the Belichick point where he's just like, no, I don't think I want to do this anymore. And I think that's where his head is at. It would, I realize these guys get addicted. And so maybe there's still a chance that he gets pulled back in, but I really don't think those odds are high.
How do you think Saban has done as your colleague at ESPN with his role on game day?
No, the one thing we always knew is anytime Alabama wasn't in the national title game, which granted was a rarity for a while there, he'd show up on the ESPN set before the game and give you the best imaginable breakdown of both teams and what was about to happen. And you just, every single time he had one of those segments, I felt like I knew the sport better. So I had, obviously with fans in the background and all the kind of the chaos and just high volume that goes along with game day, I was curious if that was the best vessel for him. But he sure, like his insight is, I mean, he's the best college football coach of all time. And that just bleeds out anytime he's saying anything is just how much he knows ball. And I thought he did great.
What can we expect from Deion Sanders and Colorado this season as they transition away from Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter?
Yeah, I mean, this is a non-Sanders team here. So it'll be, I mean, in terms of raw talent, obviously you just lost Travis Hunter, but I mean, Caden Salter, the new quarterback from Liberty, was good at Liberty. Lots of plenty of talented guys everywhere you look. And I am really curious how the offense changes, because it really did feel like, I mean, he hired Sean Lewis when he first got to Colorado, and Sean Lewis at, whether it was the Bear Raid offense, whether it was what he did at Kent State, it was a lot of running when the numbers were right and quick passes to the sideline. And it really seemed like he said, no, we're not going to do that. Ball's going to be in Shedur's hands, and he's going to keep looking downfield and trying to make a play. And it felt like everything was built around let's have Shedur make plays. But if Shedur is gone and it's just about winning games, I am curious what changes we see. Maybe they'll run the ball a little bit this year. Wouldn't be the worst idea.
Will Arch Manning live up to the hype, or at least just get close even?
I would say he'll get close. I mean, I do think I'm worried about him and a lot of new SEC quarterbacks this year that kind of have playmaker instincts and get hit a lot. A couple of them aren't going to make it the entire season. And that's going to be that was the one kind of red flag that we got from last year's, small Arch sample, was that he did get hit a lot. If he got pressured, he was getting sacked, and he trusted it he needs to figure out that timing. And that doesn't really happen until you're, in danger of getting hit. So we'll see exactly how quickly that comes along this year. But I mean, he still, we saw his arm, we saw his running abilities. We know what he's capable of. And if he's like Texas being preseason number one, I kind of joked that felt like they were overrated to me, but then I realized whoever was number one was going to feel overrated because we just have a ton of 3s and 4s this year. But if Arch is what he's supposed to be, I understand why we're starting with Texas.
Obviously an injury could change things, but assuming he stays healthy, do you think, is it a foregone conclusion that he enters the draft?
The fact that he's a man and he has the examples of Peyton and Eli staying, like I don't say it's a given, but in the end, if he's as good as as people think he's going to be, then I don't think he's going to have much left to prove at the end of this year. So I would still say well over 50% that he leaves, but he is a Manning, so we'll see.
Do you think the Mannings will try to dictate where he goes in the NFL?
Well, I mean, one of two did, or I guess one of three, including Archie. But we'll see. It would have to be a pretty bad situation. Obviously, we don't know who's going to be the worst team in the NFL just yet, but that is also in the family history, I guess.
What is the craziest college football conspiracy theory that you've came across or heard?
Well,
not necessarily. You don't have to subscribe to it,
right? Well, good. No, there's a whole lot that people can convince themselves of just from the ESPN and Fox influence. Let's just put it that way. Like you can decide that everything that's happening is having a string pulled from some big powerful entity one way or the other, and I don't think the sport's nearly controllable enough for that. So anytime we go down that road, I'm just like, come on, let's think about this for a second, guys.
Bill, you were great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.
That is Bill Connelly. I'm Brandon Contes. This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Please rate and subscribe to this podcast. Please also subscribe to Awful Announcing's YouTube page. But regardless of how you consume Awful Announcing and the Awful Announcing Podcast, thanks for listening and be good.
Thanks for listening to the Awful Announcing Podcast. For the latest news spanning the sports media landscape and more, check out awfulannouncing.com and follow us at Awful Announcing.